NATO in pursuing this almost 11-year intervention and occupation of Afghanistan, one that remains illegitimate, unjust, and immoral in the most profound sense, the longest war now in U.S. history, under which almost indescribable and unpicturable atrocities and war crimes have been committed by our government. And yet a war that is on the one hand opposed by the greatest majority of people in this country, on the one hand, and is oftentimes the furthest thing from anybody's mind in the United States, even though, as I'm sure people heard reference yesterday, $2 billion are being spent by the U.S. military to utterly destroy one of the poorest countries on the globe. One of the poorest countries on the globe being destroyed by the richest military empire in the history of the world. And I'm including NATO within that because the U.S. is the dominant force in this NATO military coalition, which is carrying out, for one thing, and most specifically, the night raids. Do you remember the controversy over the U.S. and NATO use of night raids that came to a head when General Stanley McChrystal was fired by Obama in the summer of 2010? This was one of the controversies that led to this firing. Well, guess what? These night raids are continuing to this day, justified both by NATO and by the current military command in Afghanistan. And we know from even the statistics that civilian deaths every year of the U.S. occupation have increased to where in 2011 more civilians were killed during this occupation than in any other year. The U.S., of course, says, well, this is due to the insurgents, which, by the way, they're defeating. They're winning, but the insurgents are responsible for killing more civilians. Go figure that out. All the statistics, and remember the justification of Laura Bush and George Bush for invading Afghanistan. We're doing this to save the women.
Making them widows.
Making them widows, but not only that, increasing their likelihood, actually, of dying in childbirth. In 2001, Afghanistan was the second most dangerous country in which a woman could give birth on the entire globe. 2011, it became the most dangerous country in which a woman can give birth. Add that to all of the Karzai government imposed laws and restrictions on women, which are every bit as bad as some of the things that the Taliban and the rape that the Northern Alliance brought. And you have a situation where the women in Afghanistan are suffering worse under the occupation than they did before that. And we can never, ever, ever again allow our government to get away with the argument that they're going to bring liberation for women or peace for people through a military intervention and occupation such as they've carried out in Afghanistan. This is a huge responsibility we in this country have. This destruction has been carried out in spite of the good intentions, in spite of the protests, in spite of the opposition of most of the people living in this country and most of the globe. We have yet to stop it. The fact that NATO is coming here, and again, the U.S. hides behind NATO all the time. This is somehow international cooperation. It somehow justifies this illegitimate, aggressive war launched on the people of Afghanistan. No, whoever's carrying it out, it is really a huge responsibility of ours, if only for the reason of the war on Afghanistan, to be protesting NATO. And of course, we have many other legitimate reasons to be protesting this week. But we wanted to take this moment to go deeply into what this occupation has meant. the speakers knowing that we can always bring more back into the discussion. And then we will be, fortunate to have people here coming into the discussion. So why don't we start with Eric?
Okay. Thanks a lot, Deborah.
Yeah.
In the last few months, we've seen a string of just unspeakable horrors in Afghanistan that have been the products of the U.S. and NATO occupation of that country. There was the massacre by a soldier that killed 17 Afghan civilians, mostly women and children. The posing with corpses, urinating on corpses by U.S. service members, and then the burnings of the Quran by U.S. soldiers, which touched off rioting all across the country. I think it was very interesting because that was actually happened before the massacre carried out by his name's Bales. And there really was then a huge shiver that went through the U.S. political establishment about what that might uncourt. But it's interesting because I think that the response within Afghanistan was not nearly as sort of pronounced as people had expected. I think that's in part because the Quran burning was shocking, and that led to riots. But people have been being killed in the teens and 20s and so on through drone attacks and so on for years in Afghanistan. And I think that explains more than anything why an actual massacre at point-blank range that I think shocked people in the United States really didn't quite shock people in Afghanistan as much, because they've more or less experienced that same thing over the course of now what is the longest war in American history. And I think that what's important is that, like Debra said, the United States is spending $2 billion per week in Afghanistan to prosecute a war against a country whose annual output totals about $17 billion. This really is a case of just a U.S. military power bristling with armed force, unable to subdue a resistant population. It's much like Vietnam, and it's much like other empires which have come to ruin trying to actually occupy this part of the world. And now, 10 years on, the war actually is getting more intense, and it's clear that the U.S. is losing at an even faster rate than it had been. In fact, a couple of months ago, there was a fairly startling report that was written by Lieutenant Colonel Dan Davis. He's basically a whistleblower inside the U.S. military. This doesn't happen very often, but this guy went without any real sanction from his command on a countrywide tour of Afghanistan. He said, by his own account, traveled about 9,000 miles, basically went to every U.S. base, and then wrote a report, which again was unsanctioned. He released it through Rolling Stone and the New York Times and so on. And what he found, based on his research, was that on every measure, the war is actually getting worse. Here's just a summary of some of the statistics that he found. Compared to figures for 2009, which was the last year before the Obama administration pushed a surge of troops into Afghanistan. Of course, we need to remember that though Obama is considered an anti-war president, he actually campaigned on the basis of a massive escalation in Afghanistan. So he actually has been more warlike on the question of Afghanistan than the Bush administration had been. And compared to figures for 2009, the total number of attacks in 2011 were 82% higher. The total number of IEDs, improvised explosive devices, was 113% higher. The total U.S. casualties was 164% higher. The annual number of U.S. dead and wounded increased from 1,764 in 2009 to 4,662 in 2011. And of course, they don't bother to keep account of how many Afghans they killed, but we know as well that those numbers are increasing, and now number in the tens of thousands somewhere. So this is sort of the picture that has been developing now over the course of these years of the Obama administration. And now we're faced with this NATO Summit in Chicago, where everyone's expecting kind of new announcements that will be heralding, the triumphs of NATO and the United States and Afghanistan, and ways in which there will be a handover of authority to the Afghan people, and so on and so forth. Except, for those of you who heard Kathy Kelly yesterday, I thought that she nailed it on the head when she said, look, let's really talk about what this means. First of all, we're going to continue the war until 2014, at this escalated pitch that these statistics bear out. After that, 20,000 of the most, elite special forces types, the ones that are kind of geared up for maximum brutality and violence, are going to back up the Afghan forces in a war that will continue, again, backed by drones as well, for another 10 years after 2014 to 2024. That would make this essentially a quarter-century long war against a country that was already a war-ravaged and war-torn society.